Hello and welcome to the Lions Kentucky Derby Prep. It is Matt Brown. It is Stephen Andress. Yes, it is that time of year. I know we just got through the NFL draft right into the Kentucky Derby, another incredible betting spectacle, another incredible betting event. And Stephen, it is one of those deals where, yes, we understand. Maybe you only bet 3 horse races a year. Maybe you only bet 1 horse race a year. But guess what? If you bet 1 horse race a year, we know that this is the horse race that you are betting. So we want to give you top to bottom some thoughts here on all of this. If you're watching on the video side of things, Stephen goes out, gets his very best jockey shirt that he can find. It's great. If you haven't watched the video part of this, you should head to the YouTube channel. It's absolutely free. So go ahead and take a part in that. Stephen, just right off the bat, very quick little intro to all this. One, we are recording this on the Friday prior, so we are a full week in advance of all of this. Another thing to mention here, if you haven't ever bet horses before, most of the time, there are fixed odds out there available. However, most of the time you're betting into a pari-mutuel market, which means what odds you see by the time, whenever you watch this video, are not necessarily going to be what the odds are whenever this thing actually takes place on Saturday afternoon. So just things to keep in mind, Stephen, as we're heading into all of this, that it is a little bit different when you're betting horses in everything, because we do have that deal where odds are literally changing right up to the second that the gates open.
And it's also the biggest field of any race on the entire calendar for American thoroughbred racing. So it makes it the most difficult to handicap. But if you do it properly, it also means you get the biggest payouts, even if a favorite wins. So keep that in mind. My advice as we go through this, and I give all of the big trends that have taken place over the last few decades to help us identify a Kentucky Derby winner. Maybe get out your notes, get out a pen and pencil and a piece of paper if you're old school to follow along here, because we're going to be going through a lot of metrics, a lot of numbers as we weed through this 20 horse field. Half the challenge here is eliminating the horses and looking and trying to figure out which horses not to care about. We'll be doing a little bit of that too.
Guys, if you have not bet horse racing before, there are a few different popular ways to go about that. Of course, betting just the winner of the race. Don't really recommend betting place or show. That's not really kind of how we go about tackling horse betting, really. It's really betting the winner, betting exactas, betting trifectas, and if you really want to get froggy, superfectas. If we go into it, an exacta, you are betting the exact finish of the 1 and 2 places in the race. If you're betting trifecta, it is the exact 1, 2, 3, and superfecta, as you can imagine, is 1, 2, 3, 4. You can bet those straight up if you want to, or you can box them, in which no matter what the horses are that you pick, no matter what order that those come through, you would then still win your ticket. That is a more expensive ticket, so just keep that in mind. Whenever you're thinking like, I'm going to box 9 horses in this trifecta or superfecta, you are going to run up a tab pretty quick whenever you're doing that, so just keep that in mind if you do go the boxing route. So, Stephen, anybody that's been paying attention to any of these prep races has been talking about Fierceness, and Fierceness has been a horse that has been on the radar for quite some time. It is in the fixed odds market, your favorite, as we are a week out from the race. And so from what you've seen so far, what are we getting here in Fierceness?
Well, if you look at this horse on paper and compare him to the rest of the field, his best race versus everybody else's best race, he's absolutely the rightful favorite. If we look at Beyer speed figures, which is a metric that allows us to compare horses across different races, different tracks from different days to give us a nice clean number to compare them. Fierceness has a 110 Beyer from the Florida Derby, and he also has a 107 Beyer from his Breeders' Cup Juvenile win back last year as a 2-year-old. No other horse in this field has a 100 Beyer in their most recent Kentucky Derby prep race. The only one was Mystic Dan, who put up a 101 2 races back, which a lot of handicappers think is a bit fraudulent because it was on a sloppy track and he got a perfect trip down the rails. So honestly, like compared to a lot of years when I've been handicapping the Kentucky Derby, there's at least a few that have posted a 100 plus. There are at least a few that have posted all the different criteria we're looking for. But Fierceness really is the top tier this year, and then a line, and then everybody else you might be considering. Now, with that said, Matt, the knock is he's inconsistent. When he has his best race, he's the best horse on that day. But he's also had races where things haven't gone perfectly for him and he finished third, or hasn't gone perfectly for him and he finished off the board. So it's been a bit of a zigzag with him, a good, bad, good, bad. And if that happens again, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he doesn't even hit the board in the Kentucky Derby with so much traffic and so many horses. So that's kind of where I'm at with Fierceness. And we have to figure out if you want to take a stand that he's going to win, or if you want to maybe bet on him to completely miss the board, because if that happens, the payouts are going to be astronomical on the exotics, like the exacta and the trifecta.
These are 3-year-old horses. These are some horses, Stephen, that have never run this distance before. This is something that we always hear whenever we are heading into the Kentucky Derby. What are some of the other things that we're looking at as we head into this, as far as like what has historically worked in this race? Have we seen a lot of long shots win? Have we seen guys from the outside be able to figure out how to get back in there and win, et cetera, et cetera? What are we looking at here from just kind of a more of a trend standpoint?
Well, the first trend I want to look at is simply just how they finished in their most recent prep race, because the significance of that is their most recent prep race is the longest distance they've ever run. And then the Kentucky Derby will be an even longer distance. So none of these horses have run 1.25 miles in the Derby. So the theory is that if they don't finish well in their most recent prep race, then it's probably a long shot that they do even better at a longer distance in the Kentucky Derby. And that stands up if you look at the results. Since 1996, this is where Derby winners have finished in their most recent prep race. There have been 27 of them. 17 of the 27 finished in first. 7 more finished in second. So that's 89% of Kentucky Derby winners since 1996 that have finished in the top 2 in their most recent prep race. There were 3 that finished fourth. Ironically, none finished third and went on to win the Derby, but you can see the overwhelming majority, almost 90% of Derby winners since 1996, at least finished in the top 2 in their most recent prep race. So that immediately knocks out some horses for me among win bet considerations for the 2024 Kentucky Derby. Dornock, Track Phantom, Mystic Dan, Grand Mo the First, Epic Ride, and Uncle Heavy, all immediately eliminated for me from my win bet considerations, Matt.
So when we look at some of these other, we might hear this, if people start digging in a little bit further, right? We might hear about Brisnet and Beyer and things like that or whatever, and just a brief explanation on those, and then also any trends that you're looking at from there.
Sure. Well, again, Beyer is a number assigned to a horse for that race, grading how well they ran. And it's to help us identify who's the best horse, even if they've run in different races on different days at different tracks. Same idea with Brisnet. We'll get into that a little bit. But the next trend I want to talk about, Matt, is final fractions theory. Already mentioned 1.25 miles will be the longest distance any of these horses have run. Jenny Reese, longtime, well-respected turf writer, now a publicist in the horse racing industry. She came up with the final fractions theory way back. And it basically looks at how fast did the horse run in his final furlong in his most recent prep and the final 3 furlongs in his most recent prep. And the criteria is that horse had to run 13 seconds or faster in the final furlong, or 38 seconds or faster in the final 3 furlongs. And this is held up for Kentucky Derby winners. 29 of the previous 33 Kentucky Derby winners have met at least one of these 2 criteria, including 12 of the last 13 winners. So if we look at this year's crop, what's really interesting to me is who gets knocked off of this list who didn't qualify for either. I'll start at the bottom of the point standings. These horses will probably be long shots. These are horses that didn't meet the final fractions theory in their most recent prep race. Encino, T.O. Password, one of the 2 horses coming in from Japan. Grand Mo the First, Epic Ride, Uncle Heavy, we've already eliminated them. Catalytic, who finished way behind Fierceness in the Florida Derby, did not have strong final fractions. And then Stronghold, the Santa Anita Derby winner, did not meet this criteria among final fractions. That horse is probably going to be one of the 5 favorites in the odds when they open up. And the big thing I want to emphasize here, was the Bluegrass Stakes. That was one of the prep races that I wouldn't call it like a suicidal pace on the front end of it that compromised those horses. I think is, to me, more of a fair pace that we might see again in the Kentucky Derby. None of those horses that finished at the top of the board or hit the board in the Bluegrass Stakes met the final fractions theory. I was really surprised by that because going into that race, a lot of people thought that was going to be the best race, the most respected race. So the number one horse in the Kentucky Derby standing, Sierra Leone, probably second in the odds behind Fierceness, did not meet the final fractions theory. Just a Touch. Sire was Justified. Triple Crown winner. Finished second in the Bluegrass. Did not meet the final fractions theory. Dornoch. A lot of people had high hopes for him on the Derby trail. Finished fourth in the Bluegrass. Did not meet the final fractions theory. So those horses in that prep that going in, a lot of people had respect for, I am skeptical that they're going to be running fast compared to some of these other horses that did meet the theory when it comes to running a mile quarter in the Derby. So I'm not saying don't use a Sierra Leone or a Just a Touch on your tickets in a second or third place or fourth place position in your exactas, trifectas, and superfectas, but this is another area where I start to eliminate horses, Matt, and those horses I have eliminated from win bet consideration.
Like you said, you might have them in other forms of tickets, but at least as far as outright winners, you talked about the speed figures that we look at, and like these aren't the only ones out there for people who are big time, people who are big time into horse racing. There are actually other horse racing handicapping sites that have their own speed figures. I know Horse Racing Nation has their own like speed figures and whatnot, but these are at least a couple that you look at.
Yeah, for sure. Let's start with Brisnet for the horses we still have remaining here that met the first two trends we've just talked about. Brisnet since 2019 of the past 24 Kentucky Derby winners, so a little more than 79%, had a Brisnet speed rating of at least 100 prior to running in the Kentucky Derby. And that number actually would have been 83%, 20 of the last 24, if we include Maximum Security, who crossed the wire first in the Derby, but then was DQ'd for a borderline infraction. We'll just call it that. So again, a pretty strong trend here over the past couple of decades. And the crop of horses that meet the 100 plus Brisnet in this field is a lot smaller than what it was last year. Last year, about half the field was meeting a lot of these criteria that we're talking about. And this year it's 6 or 7 in a lot of these things. So the horses that have run at least one triple digit Brisnet in their career: Sierra Leone, Fierceness, Catching Freedom, the winner of the Louisiana Derby, who came flying like a freight train at the end. Go watch that replay if you haven't seen it. Got caught out wide at the top of the stretch, still ran down everybody. Resilience, the winner of the Wood Memorial. Just a Touch, who finished second in the Bluegrass. And a couple of potential long shots here did post Brisnets of at least 100. Society Man, who finished second in the Wood Memorial. And Mystic Dan, who posted this number 2 races back in the Southwest Stakes before he finished third in the Arkansas, was a little disappointing. Again, that triple digit for him 2 races back for Mystic Dan is called into question a little bit because it was in the slop. He was able to get a good clean trip along the rail. If we get good weather, a lot of people think that he's not going to run back to that number. So we'll see. But the point here is that, that's only 7 horses that have run at least one triple digit Brisnet in their career to this point. To me, Matt, I think, it's just one of the many criteria we look at. But if we start to combine these a little bit, we start to see who maybe has the cleanest profile of them all when we get to the final thing I look at here with the Beyer speed figure.
Yeah, again, these are all things that you're just using as keys to try to whittle down the field. You mentioned it is a much bigger field in this race than all of the other races that we will be talking about. So you're using final fractions theory, you're using Brisnet, and then, of course, Beyer, which is probably the one that people are the most familiar with and hear the most often.
Yeah, it's been around since the 70s. Andy Beyer is well respected in the industry. It's the main metric that the Daily Racing Form uses, and they go back to the 1800s. That's how much of a legacy they have in American horse racing coverage. So a lot of respect there for the Beyer speed figures. And similar to the Brisnet, we have kind of a similar trend here. And of the last 32 Kentucky Derby winners, 28 of them had at least a 95 Beyer speed figure on their resume leading up to the Run for the Roses. That's 87.5% of Derby winners over that span. 11 of the previous 14 Kentucky Derby winners posted a Beyer of at least 100 in their Kentucky Derby win. So if we marry those two together, basically what it's telling us is we need a horse who can make a reasonable jump to a 100 Beyer speed figure in the Kentucky Derby if they had not run one yet already. And in this year's race, only Fierceness and Mystic Dan have already run a 100 Beyer. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to try and beat Fierceness, this kind of cutoff of 95 is really a reasonable idea that the horse can continue to improve and go from a 95 to a triple-digit Beyer. Now, it's not always set in stone. Mage won last year. Career best was a 94. So didn't meet this last year, but was pretty damn close. So again, not hard and fast rules. Basically, what I like to do is put all of these things together, Matt. And if a horse is only missing one of the criteria by the slimmest of margins, then I'm probably not eliminating them from my exotics. So looking at this field of horses that have run at least a 95 Beyer, again, there's 7 of them. Mm-hmm. And last year it was half the field. So thinner crop this year of good horses that can run this distance at a decent speed. It's the usual suspects at the top, the 2 leaders in the Kentucky Derby point standing, Sierra Leone, Fierceness, and Catching Freedom. Beyond that, Just a Touch did earn a 96 Beyer in the Bluegrass, even though I'm skeptical of the final fractions from that race. Domestic Product is interesting. Did not earn a 95 Beyer, but I would at least keep an eye on him with his final fractions. The other 2 long shots that I definitely need to consider here, maybe even for a long shot win bet. Just Steel, trained by the legendary Dean Wayne Lucas, who's in his 80s, ran second to Muth in the Arkansas Derby. Muth is not running in this race because he's trained by Bob Baffert, suspended. So Just Steel doesn't need to worry about beating Muth in this race. Got a 95 Beyer for that runner-up finish. Honor Marie was second to Catching Freedom, was also running really hard at the end in the Louisiana Derby, coming way wide and still catching everybody. 96 Beyer in that race. And then we've talked about Mystic Dan a couple of times, had a triple-digit Beyer 2 races back, not in his most recent third-place finish in the Arkansas Derby. So, you're hearing a lot of names multiple times here. And, Matt, I think it's time now to talk about the horses who meet all 4 criteria.
Yeah, so just to give everyone an idea here, Stephen, again, these will change by the time, maybe you're even watching this, but to give you an idea of which horses, at least right now, are looking like they're going to be towards the top of the odds board here. As you mentioned, Fierceness on the fixed odds markets. This is a book right now that is posting fixed odds out there. Fierceness is your favorite, sitting about 2.5, plus 275. Sierra Leone plus 375. Outside of that, you do then go to Dornoch, Catching Freedom is 1125. You get Dornoch at 15. Forever Young is at 10 right now. As far as that goes, Stephen, those are the only, Just a Touch is at 15 as well. Those are the only ones that are under 20 to 1, but that gives you a decent idea of who is very likely to be the shortest odds as we head into the race.
Yeah, for sure. And it's no surprise that those odds, at least at the top, should reflect the horses that fit a lot of these criteria. And when we look at all 4 of the criteria we've talked about, Matt, a top 2 finish in their most recent prep, fitting the final fractions theory, a Brisnet on their resume of at least a 100, a Beyer on the resume of at least 95. There's only 2 horses in this field that meet all of those criteria. The first is an obvious one. It's Fierceness. I mean, we already talked about he's in a tier of his own if he runs his best race. If he runs his best race, they're all running for second. The other is Catching Freedom. And it's not just that Catching Freedom won the Louisiana Derby, which, by the way, is the longest of the prep races. It's about 1 mile and 3/16. So he only has another 16th of a mile to go, where all these other horses, for the most part, have an extra 1/8 of a mile to go. It's not just that he won that race coming from the back all the way to the front. It's that he caught everybody so impressively when it was a slow pace on the front end of the Louisiana Derby. And if you look at his final fractions, it's not just that he meets the criteria, it's that he's the fastest in the field, with the exception of Domestic Product, who had by far the slowest pace of any prep race that he got to run into. We're not going to get a 50-second half mile in the Derby like we did in the Tampa Bay Derby. That's just not going to happen for Domestic Product. So very skeptical of those final fractions for Domestic Product now going to a much tougher race. And the Tampa Bay Derby, not even considered one of the top prep races. It was also 6 weeks ago, a lot bigger of a gap between races than these other horses have had with 3 or 4 weeks. So if we're not even going to consider Domestic Product on the win line, then Catching Freedom has easily the top fractions for the last furlong and the last 3 furlongs. Really impressive stuff. So Catching Freedom, if you're trying to beat Fierceness, would be my top pick to do that, Matt.
What about the horses that didn't quite make it into that top list?
Yeah, good question. I will say this. There are a few that I think have reasonable excuses, and there are a few that I think you still have to ignore, even though they may not fit one of the criteria. So here's the list of horses that fit all but one of the 4 criteria we talked about. Sierra Leone, who really barely just missed the final fractions theory. And I'm talking by like a couple hundredths of a second for both the 1 and 3 furlong times. So is that like Muth last year only having 1 point less for the Beyer criteria, that it's close enough that we probably shouldn't toss him? I think so. I think it's going to be hard to not put Sierra Leone at least on your exotics. Honor Marie is another one that was just off. I really like Honor Marie. The only thing that's missing for him is the Brisnet. We're looking for 100 or more. They gave him a 99 in the Louisiana Derby. So go back, watch the replay of the Louisiana Derby. Catching Freedom and Honor Marie both were caught really wide on the far turn and actually ran into each other a little bit. So 5 and 6 wide, bumped into each other, and despite that, still passed everybody and finished 1-2 in the Louisiana Derby. That was really impressive to me for both of those horses. So I think Honor Marie is very live to win the Kentucky Derby this year, especially if we get an honest pace on the front end. If you're using Catching Freedom in your exotics, I don't know how you don't also use Honor Marie. Resilience, the winner of the Wood, met all but one criteria, but the one criteria he didn't meet really makes me skeptical. It was the Beyer, and it was well under the 95 that we're looking for. They only gave him a 90 for the Wood. The Brisnet and the Beyer really disagree with each other when it comes to the Wood Memorial this year. They gave him a 104 Brisnet, but only a 90 Beyer. And he did meet the final fractions theory too. So I need to dig a little bit more. I think I would invite all of you guys to dig a little bit more, see if we can come up with a good, reasonable explanation why the Brisnet really liked the Wood Memorial, but the Beyer did not. That's the important question in handicapping this race. At this juncture, I don't really have a good answer for you on why that is. But typically, I have trusted the Beyer more in my handicapping of the Kentucky Derby for what that's worth. Just a Touch, the second place finisher in the Bluegrass, met all but one criteria. Again, final fractions is where he didn't meet it. Just Steel met all but one criteria. He did not meet the Brisnet. He was given a 97 for his runner-up in that race. Society Man, probably a really big long shot in this race. Again, Brisnet gave him 102, but the Beyer only gave him an 87 for coming in second in the wood. It's just weird. I don't quite get it. He met one of the two final fractions theory, the final furlong, not the final 3 furlongs, but he will be a long shot if you want to consider using him underneath. And Mystic Dan, the other, met all but one. He's meeting this criteria because of that race 2 back, where he put up the triple digit Beyer final fractions, but then ran a disappointing race in his most recent race, the 3rd place in the Arkansas Derby behind Muth and Just Steel. So if you believe in the zigzag pattern and Mystic Dan's going to come back and run a better race after having a bit of a disappointment, then perhaps you're going to want to be on him. But again, there are potential reasons and fair excuses and explanations for why he may have been able to do what he did 2 races back and didn't run back to it on a faster track against better competition in his most recent race. So yeah, 2 horses meet all of the criteria. 7 horses meet all but one. Of those 7, the ones I like the most would be Honor Marie, Sierra Leone, and Just Steel, and maybe still Just a Touch, just because of that pedigree would justify a triple crown winner in his lineage.
All right, Stephen, let's just say I'm going to give you 100 Matt bucks, and you get free 100 Matt bucks to go in, and you're going to be able to sprinkle that around however you want to do it. What are you going to do with those 100 Matt bucks?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for your very generous.
You're welcome. I'm kind-hearted. I am. Yes.
All right. So here we go. I'm going to take shots in the Kentucky Derby. Like, this is the race where exotics are going to pay out so much more than any other race on the year. Even if Fierceness comes in first, you get a couple long shots underneath. It's going to bump up that pay. So if I'm taking $100, I'm using 80% of it on exotics because I'm going for it, man. But I will try and beat Fierceness here. I think him potentially running into some trouble is more likely in the Derby than any other race he'll ever run, because there's 19 other opponents in this race and 19 other jockeys that want to sabotage him. So it might get ugly in there. So I'm going to take a shot against Fierceness in most of these bets. Let's start with the win bet. I'll put $20 on Catching Freedom, hoping to get about 10 to 1 on him. If that just comes in, then I've basically doubled my money for the day, and it's a good day. So I'll put $20 on Catching Freedom. The next will be a $2 exacta box. I'll put Catching Freedom and Honor Marie on the top line to come in first or second. And then I will add 4 horses in the second place position: Sierra Leone, Just a Touch, and Mystic Dan, and also Just Steel. That $2 exacta ticket will cost you $20. I will then still try to beat Fierceness with a 50-cent trifecta. I'll have these 3 horses in all 3 positions: Catching Freedom, Honor Marie, and Just Steel. And I'll also sprinkle in these 3 horses in the second and third place positions: Sierra Leone, Just a Touch, and Mystic Dan. That ticket will cost you $30. The last bet will be a $1 trifecta, because Fierceness is really freaking good. And again, if he runs his race, if he has things go his way and he doesn't get into a lot of trouble with traffic or bumping out of the gate, if all these horses run their best race, it's Fierceness probably by at least a couple of lengths. So I'll do a $1 trifecta with only Fierceness in the first place spot. Just single him in that first place spot, because I think he's either running a huge race, or if you look at his results and when he's running into trouble, he doesn't even hit the board. Mm-hmm. So I'm fine with that. And if he runs into a suicidal pace, I think he's really liable to not finish second or third. So I'll take Fierceness soloed in the first place spot on this $1 trifecta, and I'll have several horses in the second and third place position. Those horses will be Just a Touch, Just Steel, Mystic Dan, Sierra Leone, Catching Freedom, and Honor Marie. That ticket costs $30. So these 4 bets I've mentioned, the win bet, the 2 different trifectas, and the exacta, That's $100, Matt, right there.
Guys, again, if you're new to horse betting, just remember, win bet, the horse has to win. Exacta is first and second place. Trifecta, first, second, and third place is how this all pays out. And remember, like Steven said, it's a bigger race. The odds get really ballooned out. You can make some decent money, even if you do have some of these short shots get home in one of these positions, in one of these finishing positions.
Matt, can I give one more piece of advice here?
Sure.
We didn't give any superfectas because they can get really expensive, but again, it's the Kentucky Derby, and I think it's worth at least sprinkling a superfecta. So what I would suggest is do your $1 superfecta, have 2 horses in the first and second place position, have 2 different horses in the third and fourth place position. That's your lottery ticket. The ticket only costs $4. And if you look at some of the superfecta payouts over the years for the Derby, I mean, they're just astronomical. It's not out of the realm of possibility that you get a 5-figure payday. So that would be my advice, just for a cheap way to go after the Derby lottery ticket with the superfecta. It only costs $4.
Yeah, if you wanted to box 4 horses even, you can go as low as 10 cents on a superfecta bet, so just keep that in mind as well. You don't always have to be betting in whole numbers, so just keep that in mind as you're going in and making your bets as well. Stephen will be talking the Derby all week long, so be sure and check out all of not only the articles, but the programming that we do here on the channel over in the Discord as well, if you want to get some last-minute thoughts on all of this. Reminder, the odds you see today as you're watching this video probably will not be the odds that will be happening on Saturday afternoon. So just remember that that's just how horse racing works, right? Unless you're betting a fixed odds price, which are available at some of the sports books out there, the odds will be changing right up until those gates opening.
And that's a good thing this year if you're trying to beat Fierceness, because there's going to be so much money bet on Fierceness. We're going to get some good numbers on these other horses. So that's a good thing.
Yes. So guys, again, if you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button. Give us a like. Give us some comments in there. If you want some other questions answered, maybe we'll hop back in here at some point throughout the course of the week to do that as well. So for Steven, I'm Matt. Good luck on all your Kentucky Derby bets.